Good morning, family. This morning we're going to continue in Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7. So I'll give you a moment to turn there. As we study Daniel chapter 7, either this morning or perhaps the next time we're together, it's also going to take us into Daniel chapter 2 and very probably really into chapters 1 through 6 intermittently. So Daniel chapter 7, and we've read this text before, so we'll begin in verse 1. Actually, let's begin in Daniel chapter 6 verse 28 just to reorient ourselves historically. And I've explained some of this historical backstory already, so please refer back to the prior videos if you'd like to do that. And there it says, so Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius, or Darius, as he's frequently as his name is frequently pronounced. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and during the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And you'll remember that before these, at the very beginning of his exile in Babylon, that Daniel served Nebuchadnezzar II, who was the king and military commander who, with his army, overthrew Jerusalem in 586 BC in the summertime on the 9th day of the month of Av, which corresponds with late July, early August, from year to year on our calendars, and they move a little bit because of the nature of lunar and solar calendars, and the fact that the ancient peoples had a 360-day year instead of a 364 and a half or 365-day year as we do. And then in verse 1 of chapter 7, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying on his bed. And he wrote down the substance of the dream. And here's the substance of it. We've covered through verse 1 previously. Now, this is around 550 BC. And remember that Belshazzar is a king. He's the son, rather, of King Nabonidus, and he was his vice regent. So, like we would use the term vice president. I had previously said co-regent, but that's not exactly the way I understand it. I think he was vice, not co, that is, serving under his father Nabonidus, and there's more history involved there that we know about from other ancient documents. And in verse 2, Daniel said, and here's the substance of his dream. And incidentally, if you're taking notes, and I hope you are, you you might also write Revelation 1, chapter 11, Revelation 1, chapter 11, and also verse 19. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and read those because I think that they'll be kind of instructive. And I think what we need to be looking at here is that John, the apostle who was commanded by Jesus to write down the revelation, the apocalypse, the apocalypsis, the lifting of the veil, the revealing of the book of Revelation. Remember that John, the revelator, the one who's writing this down, that he quotes, that he cites, that is, and he alludes to the Old Testament exhaustively in the book of Revelation. And so notice that, well, let's go back to verse 9. Let me make sure I'm getting all my cross references right. Says, I, John, your brother and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of the Lord, the word of God, and the testimony of Jesus. On the Lord's day, I was in the Spirit, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet that said, write on a scroll what you see and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me, and when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and among the lampstands was someone like a son of man, like a human being. Notice how this connects with John chapter 3, which we've previously studied, and with the text in Daniel that we've already read that we're going to study in more detail. And that someone like a son of man was dressed in a robe, reaching down to his feet, and with a golden sash around his chest. His head and hair were white like wool, white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. Notice here that the human being, the Son of Man, a Son of Man, here has the attributes that the Ancient of Days from Daniel chapter 7, who has hair white like wool. And his feet, let's back up. I missed a phrase. And his eyes were like blazing fire. Remember the fire that's mentioned in Daniel 7. And his feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace. In other words, they were bright and lustrous and shiny. When we melt metals, of course, they shine, and bronze it glimmers when it's molten. When it's it almost looks like a reddish gold. And his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. In his hand he held 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a sharp double-edged sword. His face was like the sun shining in all its brilliance. Remember, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, that is, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, being in the fiery furnace, also in Daniel, prior to chapter 7, of course. So that's leading up to chapter 7. Remember that chapters 1 through 6 of Daniel are narrative, that is, historical narrative, giving us the details of what was taking place. And then Daniel chapter 7 is apocalyptic, that is, it's revelatory, it's a lifting of the veil. It tells us things that the Lord wanted Daniel to know. He wanted the ancient Israelites to know, and by association, by extension, because we're also his people, those things were not written to us, but written for us, and so they are for us and for our learning, for our enlightenment in the scriptures. So his face was shining like the sun in all its brilliance. Remember that in the fiery furnace with Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, that there's one standing there, and his appearance is bright like the sun. So notice the correlation here, and I can't help but believe. In fact, I'm certain within my own understanding that these are allusions to the Christ, to the Messiah pre-incarnate in the book of Daniel, and to the Ancient of Days. And here, the Son of Man and the Ancient of Days, their attributes are conjoined. They're combined. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Then he placed his right hand upon me and said, notice right hand, the hand of favor, do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. Of course, here elsewhere in verse 8, we began in verse 9, Jesus said, I am the Alpha and the Omega. Alpha is the first letter of the Greek alphabet. Omega is the final letter. So we would say A to Z, but Omega is an O vowel. The Greek alphabet ends with a hard, long O. So the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, it says here in verse 17. So, what does this remind us of? Well, we've been studying the names, the attributes, the divine nature of God in the Old Testament. Now studying those same attributes, names, the nature of Christ is revealed in the New Testament. Well, Yahweh means the one who eternally is. So here, another way of expressing Yahweh's nature is to say he is the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. And I said we're going to read through verse 17, but let's read a little more. Verse 18, I am the living one. I was dead, and behold, I am alive forever and ever. And I hold the keys of death and Hades. Write therefore what you've seen, what is now, and what will take place later. And we're going to pause there because it's just going to keep going, and that's wonderful. But what I want us to focus on here is that John is in a role very similar to Daniel's role in Daniel chapter 7. He's not asleep having a dream, but here it says that he was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. And then in verse 10, on the Lord's day, I was in the Spirit and heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet. And so that was the voice of Christ himself. So John is having a visual experience. He's having a vision. He's seeing things that the Lord was revealing to him. Here, the Lord Jesus is referred to as one like a son of man, but again, he has the attributes of the Ancient of Days. In fact, just to get us back into that way of thinking, let's read from Daniel chapter 7 and beginning in verse 9. And Daniel said, as I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat, and his clothing was as white as snow, and the hair of his head was like wool. And his throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze, and a river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. And thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were open. And then let's go down to verse 13. And then Daniel continues, now speaking about the Messiah. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, a human being, coming with the clouds of heaven. And he approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. Now, here's the connection with Revelation chapter 1. Notice that he is the Almighty. He's the Alpha, the Omega, the first and the last. He is Yahweh made visible. For John to see, one day for all of us to see. And notice what it says. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence, and he was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. Those three things. And also all peoples, nations, and people of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, and we see this in the book of Revelation, don't we? That will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. And then Daniel says he's disturbed in his spirit. Remember, it says that in verse 15. Remember that John falls like one who's dead, and Jesus reaches down and touches him with his right hand and says, do not be afraid. So Daniel, in his vision at night, verse 2 of chapter 7 of Daniel, I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven, churning up the great sea. Now, the four winds represent the four cardinal directions. So north, south, east, and west, okay? The four winds of heaven were churning up, making violent, making chaotic the great sea. Now, the sea in the Bible very frequently represents chaos. It represents torment, turmoil. And incidentally, many of the false pagan, demonic, satanic gods mentioned in the Bible, um, including the one named Yam, we'd spell it YAM, like yam, like we're yams, sweet potatoes. Of course, those vegetables are different, but we refer to them the same way. Yams at Thanksgiving, um, but yam spelled the same way in English. Yam is a satanic, a pagan god of the sea, of the ocean. Think of Poseidon or um, I just lost my train of thought. Um, Neptune to the Greeks and the Romans. Um, and you know that from Roman mythology, out of the sea comes the Kraken and Homeric, that is Homer's literature. Um, Good things come out of the sea, but really bad, really dangerous, really evil, really hurtful, dangerous, chaotic things also come out of the sea in the minds of the ancient peoples. So, from the four winds, um, I believe that this verse right here in my vision at night, I looked at there before me were the four winds of heaven churning up the great sea. Let's turn to Zechariah chapter 6, verses 5 through 7. We may read a little more than that. Let me look. Yeah, let's go back to verse 6, chapter 6 of Zechariah, verse 1. It says, I looked up again, and there before me were four chariots coming out from between two mountains, mountains of bronze. The first chariot had red horses, the second black, the third white, and the fourth dappled, all of them powerful. This is a reminder of the four horses, the four horsemen out of Revelation. Um, we see parallels to those, don't we? Verse 4, I asked the angel who was speaking to me, what are these, Lord? And he's not, he might be referring to him as, when we read the word Lord in the scriptures, sometimes it's referring to God, sometimes it's a term of respect, like in English literature during the Elizabethan, Shakespearean, King James days, meaning sir or master, someone who is above you. And the angel answered me, now don't miss this, these are the four spirits of heaven. Now, in the Greek Old Testament and in the Greek New Testament, the word pneuma that we get pneumatic from, or pneumonia, has to do with what? With breath, with wind, with spirits. The same word can be translated all of those ways, as spirits, as wind, as breath. The angel answered me, these are the four spirits, or the four winds of heaven, going out from standing in the presence of the Lord of the whole world. The one with the black horses is going toward the north country, the one with the white horses toward the west, and the one with the dappled horses toward the south. Verse 7, when the powerful horses went out, they were straining to go throughout the earth. And he said, go throughout the earth. So they went throughout the earth. Then he called to me, saying, look, those going toward the north country have given my spirit rest in the land of the north. Now, there's a lot of context there, but I just want you to see thematic connections and parallels to see that the Bible is all interconnected. And so, as you're taking notes, they're related to the four winds of heaven in verse 2 of Daniel chapter 7. Write down Zechariah chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. Zechariah chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. Now, again, whether or not a verse is best translated there, spirit, wind, or breath, depends on the Hebrew, the Greek text, the Aramaic text in Daniel. Anytime that we're interpreting, that we're translating the Bible, context is the key. So, which is the best translation? Well, a deep study and digging into the context tells us. But I just thought I should make that comment. In other words, you can't just wantonly, flippantly just use any word, even though it might be a correct translation of that word in various contexts. Context tells us which one it is. So, Daniel said, verse 2, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven. Maybe this could be understood be four spirits of heaven, churning up the great sea. There's more to say about that. Four great beasts, notice this, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. If you've ever watched or read the Homeric works about the Kraken, you've seen the movies, Jason and the Argonauts, that whole series of old movies from what were they, from the 60s, maybe the 70s, or anything else. This type of chaos coming out of the sea, in Japanese culture, that's come into our culture about Godzilla and these kinds of things, Poseidon, Neptune, sea monsters. You can look on ancient maps from Europe, and they're out in the middle of the ocean. They'll have dragons, sea monsters, whales, different kinds of things. And sometimes on the map, it'll say something like from the English high-masted sailing ship period, sea monsters be here. And so were they talking about giant squid, or were they talking about whales? We don't always know. But notice that since ancient times, this idea of chaos coming up out of the sea is well attested. Okay. Notice there are four great beasts, each different from the others. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a man, and the heart of a man was given to it. Okay, now, however, let's go to Daniel chapter 2.